formatting our strings. Welcome to Homa Studio in this Python for Beginners series video, where we're just going to introduce strings and having variables represent strings and putting them together in sentences or statements and formatting our strings. So we're going to combine variables together, and we're going to use 4 different methods: the comma method, concatenation, the format method, and f-strings. In our last video, we were introduced to operators in math. We worked with variables a little bit, and we did addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, different types of division, just with math operators, and we worked with integers primarily. And in this video, we're going to work with strings. So I'm going to close this up. I'll make a new file in VS Code. I'll go here to the new file icon, and I'll just call it strings for now. Give it a .py extension. And I'm just going to make a couple strings here. We'll just make 2. And we'll use variables to represent those strings. The first one will just be name, and I'll say name equals, and in quotes I'll just put a name called Steve, and then I'll put an age, and I'll put age equals, and in quotes I'll put 51. Now you might say, well, that's a number, why you're putting that as a string? Well, unless we're doing math, we don't necessarily have to have it as an integer. If we were adding things together and adding years up and figuring out when Steve is going to be 60 and things like that, we might have to have it as an integer. But right now, if we're just displaying the number itself, it can just be a string. So that's fine right now. And it'll be easier to kind of combine it together and output it in a string. And now we're going to output in a string, meaning we're going to print out a sentence with these variables inside them. So I'm just going to make a print statement, and I'll put my parentheses, and I'm just going to do very simply, I'll make a string, and I'll say my name is, and then after this string I'm going to put a comma, and I'm going to put name, and then I'm going to put a comma again, and then and I am, and then a comma, and then I'm going to put age and a comma, and I'll put years old. So my name is blank and I am what years. I mean, that's something a little kid would say, but not a 51-year-old, but we'll try this out just to start. So we'll output this right now. And I'm going to right click over here and say run Python file and terminal. And it says my name is Steve and I am 51 years old. And that worked fine. And I'm going to put comma method here because we're just using commas in between the variables. So you can see we're putting a string and then a comma. We're separating variables with commas. And they always put a space in there. So it worked out okay that it put spaces. So if we had to put other commas in there, it can sometimes be a problem. And notice how we have to split up the strings. We have to put quotes around the strings, and then our variables don't have quotes, and then our strings have quotes, and then our variables don't have quotes. So let's try another method. Now this method isn't easier. You might be familiar with this from like JavaScript or something. This is concatenation, and we did this in one of the other videos, actually just with math. And I'll say concat just to shorten it. And the way this works is they use plus signs, almost like they're adding them together. So you don't need the commas in here. And you don't have to put spaces on either side of the plus signs, but I like to because I think it's easier to read. So I always try to put spaces on either side of the pluses when you're doing that. So this is concatenation. You might have seen that with JavaScript or ActionScript or something like that. Now when you do this, I'm going to output this. You can see down here it's running things together. It's not recognizing spaces in here. The commas we're putting spaces in, but this is not. So what you have to do with this is you have to put spaces in with the string. So I have to put a space here on either side of the string. Any place I want a space around the variable that's there, I have to make sure I build them into the string. Another thing I'm going to put in the string, I'm going to put \n, and that's an escape character that's creating a new line. So hopefully it'll separate these things a little bit. And let's output this in the terminal. And here it is. My name is Steve and I am 51 years old. My name is Steve and I am 51 years old. So those are 2 methods to do that. Now another method in Python is called the format method. And there is even a newer method than this, but this is very common. And instead of using plus signs in here, you could basically take the variable and just put curly brackets around it and just take these out. Another method will put the names in here. This one will not. And you don't need the plus signs, and you also don't need the extra quotes because it treats these things as part of it. They're kind of inserted as part of the string. So if I get rid of all these things and clear it all out of what I'm doing here, it's just one big string, and wherever it sees the curly brackets, it knows to put a variable in there. Now, it won't know to do this yet unless you do this .format, and then in parentheses, you're going to put what the variables are. So I'm going to put name, comma, age. So I'm listing in almost a little list here in parentheses after format. It's almost running like a mini kind of function in here, and it's going to put those things in here. So let's run that and see what happens. And my name is Steve, 51 years old, and they all look the same. So that's working fine. Now, one thing you could do too, if you, let's say just for example, you put these in the wrong order. You're just like age, name, and you didn't put them in the right order, and you went to output them. It says, my name is 51 and I am Steve years old. You can actually put the number from this little list here in here. So if you said, oh, I want the first one here and the second one here, you could do that. Now, of course, I'm doing this wrong. So before you start screaming at the video, you know that's wrong because computers start with 0, not with 1. So if you did this, if you didn't know that and you did this, you'd get an error because it says it's out of range because there's no 2 in here. So you'd have to do 1, and this one would have to be 0. So you can put in the order here of these things. So if I run it again, now it's looking fine. And the last method that I'll just show here is kind of using the same one, but it's more of a modern method. I think it started with Python 3.6. So if you use things like how to think like a computer scientist and in their little editing areas, sometimes this won't work. But this is the easiest one to do. And the nice thing is, it doesn't matter if there's a string or an integer in here as the variable. And you don't have to put this stuff at the end. You don't need that dot format, but you do put the variable name right in here, which is actually easy. And the only thing you have to do is make sure you put an F in front of the string. That's why they call it the fstring method. So you just put an F outside of the string, and you run your string here. Now keep in mind the new line character does go inside the string. It recognizes that. It's like a hidden character. But these things can work in here like that. So if we run this, you can see everything works fine. So this is the easiest method and the newest method. And I'll show you also why it's easy if we ever decide that, well, we're going to use an integer here instead of a string, and we run it. You get an error. And where you get the error is actually in this one because it doesn't like combining because you're using plus with a string and plus with an integer. You'd actually have to go in here and convert this age to a string so that it all outputs together consistently. Otherwise, it's thinking that it's trying to add a number with a word, which doesn't really work. So if you did that, it would actually work. Now there they are. There's your output. But you know, that's more work. So this one is simple, but it could be a problem because you're dealing with all the commas, and it's always adding spaces in between there. So if you don't want spaces, or if you wanted to output a comma in there, it gets a little problematic. The concat method gets a little confusing because you're adding all these pluses in there. If you're combining variables that represent strings and a variable that represents an integer, it becomes a problem because you got to convert it to a string. Plus you got to worry about the spaces and the quotes and in between and all that. That can sometimes be a pain. This method is fine, other than you have to add this at the end. But this is a nice go back if this method doesn't work. If you're using an older version of Python, this should work. And this is the easiest method because you could use variables that represent strings, variables that represent integers or floats or anything like that, and you combine them all together in one string, and all you need is just an F at the beginning. So this is probably the easiest method out of the 4 that I'm showing. Now there's old school methods that use percents and things like that. And we're also going to review formatting numbers and combining numbers and strings together, but just to give a little introduction to strings, that's all I want to do in this video. So that's it for strings, and we're going to continue moving on by combining them together.